Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. I'd like to talk to you today, as you have just probably already been informed, regarding one of the contributions of our teacher, Ustaz Javed Ghamidi, in the form of a Quran translated. You'll find it in a single volume. So you would be knowing that he has written a tafsir in 5 volumes. The tafsir is basically an annotated tafsir, which means that there's a translation and then there are annotated notes on that translation, which make up bulk of the tafsir. So that particular translation has also been published separately as a single volume book. And obviously, he wrote it in Urdu, and I had the honor of translating it into the English language and have been doing so for the past many years. In fact, I think I am not wrong. I started off at the time when he started. So I was translating his Urdu works into English in parallel with his own production. So this started around 1992 or somewhere around that, that's 30 years ago, and we just did about like a couple of verses every day or something like that. And this went on for about 14, 15 years, a couple of verses every day, a couple of verses maybe uh, twice a week, something like that. But then in 2007, this took a new turn when our stars completed his book on Mizan, which you, of course, might be knowing. So when he finished that book in 2007, it was then that he started giving full time to his Al-Bayan translation, and I also was able to devote more time. So the first 14 or 15 years were like drops in the ocean, I would say, and he was concentrating more on his Mizan, which is, of course, a comprehensive introduction to the Quran, the way he has understood it. And it is for the next 7 to 8 years, then he devoted himself to the tafsir and translation. And then it was in 2014 that he was able to finish the tafsir, the 5 volumes, and they were published in the next couple of years. And then from that tafsir, actually, he redid translation, because you see, when you're writing a tafsir and a translation, because you know there are annotations below the tafsir or below the translation. So at times your own translation is not that elaborate, because you know it would be already elaborated upon in the annotations. So when he picked out the translation part to publish it in a single volume, in one single volume, so he was faced with this dilemma that there are certain further explanations which are required. If you don't have a annotation, I mean, if you don't have an annotated translation, then a simple translation would also require some notes. So he ended up redoing the translation in a lot of ways, and then adding very short, very short footnotes to that translation. So the one that you now have in that single one volume is what he did, and it got published about 3 years ago, maybe more. I think it was 2018, and very close to that, I finished the English rendering as well. So this was a bit of history regarding its translation. But since I'm going to talk more about the contribution that this translation is likely to have make in the future, and already has had some impact in the past, so I talk about some of its features. So one of the most distinctive features of this translation is what the Quran itself talks about itself, and that is that Quran addresses the mind. It does not address one's emotions. It addresses one's mind, and so therefore, whatever it argues in favor of is something which it always reasons out. So when it asks us to believe in God, to believe in the hereafter, to believe in angels, to all those 5 beliefs, it's not just a dogmatic presentation, or not just something which is meant for us to accept on face value without any reasoning, without any logical explanation behind it. So the argument which is built up by the Quran in favor of all these beliefs is that uh, as far as the hereafter is concerned, as far as belief in the Prophet is concerned, as far as in the existence of the Almighty is concerned, these are all rationally understood realities. They are not dogmatic realities which you have to force down your throat and accept them just because you have been born a Muslim, or just because you have been made to realize that this is something that you have to stand up to. So, as far as this translation goes, you'll find out that one of the distinctive features, as I said, is that since the Quran addresses the mind, it addresses your intellect. So, the way you'll read this translation, you'll understand as you go through it that the premises on which the Quran makes its, I would say, corollaries or branches communicate them to us is in the garb of reasoning. So typically, if I pick up a few subjects, for example, the fact that there is going to be a hereafter, there's going to be an accountability in the hereafter. I think the greatest proof which has been presented in the Quran, which this translation makes use of and abundantly communicates to all its readers, is the fact that, for example, one's own conscience is one of the biggest judges of the fact that there's going to be an accountability. So you see, the Almighty has created us in a way that we are not born blind. We have the awareness of good and evil in our own selves. We have this conscience which pricks us for any bad thing that we do. It praises us for any good thing which we do. So this would mean that the Creator who has put this conscience in us must distinguish between good and evil. There is this distinction, but in this world we don't find this distinction happening. We find, good people being punished or put in the spot of bother, bad people making the best of their days. So this gives us this background that, of course, conscience, if it is there, the fact that we are able to discern between good and evil, it shows that there is going to be a day of accountability, according to which good and bad people will be rewarded on the basis of what they did. Otherwise, there would have been no logical explanation of why human conscience exists. Similarly, the Quran itself argues in favor of its own divinity. And one of the biggest arguments it makes in favor of its own divinity is that لَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا, which means that had the Quran been from someone other than God, you would have found a lot of discrepancies in the Quran. So the fact that the Quran is a book, is a documented book, which does not have any discrepancies. It's a well-argued book. It has stood up to the test of time. It has stood up to the test of so many centuries, in which the information which has been divulged in the Quran has never ever been negated. And although the Quran is not a book of science, but it does refer to a lot of scientific facts. And these scientific facts have always stood the test of time, whether it's some astronomical observations, whether it's regarding the features, for example. So all these facts have stood up the test of time, thereby establishing this basic premise that as far as the reasoning is concerned, as far as the argumentation is concerned, it is soundly established in the Quran. And when the Quran asks us to, for example, believe in the hereafter or believe in the prophets of God, then to just elaborate my last point, that the biggest argument in favor of Prophet Muhammad's own prophethood is the Quran itself, that it is free of any discrepancies. He was a person who was born without any formal education, and the Arabs knew this very well. And it was suddenly out of the blue that at the age of 40 that he declared that he has been given prophethood, and he produced a book about which formerly he was not even educated. So it was like a miracle being produced by a person who was virtually illiterate. And at the same time, he was also regarded with with a lot of acclaim. He was regarded to be a person who was always dependent. He was given these honorific titles of being Sadiq and Amin. And so therefore the Arabs, when they looked upon a person who was claiming to be a prophet of God, and at the same time producing something about which you could easily compare that all human compositions and all divine compositions, they have a distinct difference. So in all human compositions, all books which are authored by human beings, what you find is that there is a gradual evolution of ideas. At times you pick an idea, you examine that idea, you give up the idea, and then you take up on a new idea or a new theory. So human beings are fraught with this, I would say, dilemma that they continue their search for truth, and in this process, they accept many things and they reject many things, and it's like a process that is ongoing. And you can pick up any number of people like Einstein or Karl Marx or Socrates, and you'll find that their ideas have undergone tremendous evolution. And then, of course, they are also not free of any discrepancy. So the Quran argues in favor of Prophet Muhammad by saying that the word that he produced or the book that he produced is free of any discrepancy. And if you think that there is something that you can produce similar to it, and it gives this challenge to people around them. It says that, okay, bring one surah like it. So the point that I'm making here is that the Quran addresses the mind. It does not in any way forces down its beliefs down our throat, It argues in favor of the Almighty. It argues in favor of the hereafter. Regarding the hereafter, it tells us that this world would be in an unjust world if it is created such that there is no sequel to it, such that there is nothing to follow it. Otherwise, either we believe in a creator who is not just, or we believe in another world in which his justice will ultimately take place and take shape. So this is how the Quran proceeds, and I have found that this translation does justice to these themes of the Quran by arguing in favor of all these logically understood realities. And so therefore, when we read the translation of the Quran, we are given this assurance, or we find this assurance building up in ourselves that yes, the book of God is something which has communicated to our minds, and it is something that we can communicate to other people as well. As far as emotions are concerned, yes, once you accept certain realities, certain facts, you follow them through your emotions, but not the other way around. And also, the intellect is something which forms a bridge between you and the rest of humanity. And the Quran, the way it addresses all of us, is a book in which intellect has been, given this top-notch standing, I would say. So the Quran at a number of places says, "Allahum yatafakkarun, yatadabbarun," and all these verbs actually invite us that it is a book which is sent down to men of understanding. It is sent down to people who must use their understanding and not dogmatically accept certain things. And if they do so, they'll not have a living relationship with the Almighty. You see, one of the biggest things that we need to understand is that we just cannot afford a mechanical relationship with the Almighty. You must have a living relationship. And that living relationship can only be established if we are able to understand where he's coming from, we acknowledge where he's coming from, and we relish whatever he's saying. We see as if it's the call of our own mind or the call of our own nature. And this is something which is really exhilarating, I would say. It gives you this big boost in your own life, that you feel that yes, the Almighty is someone with whom we can connect, not only directly, but to one of his greatest masterpieces, which is his own book. So the first thing is that we have to understand that all these Quranic notions, or all these beliefs of the Quran that it requires us to profess faith into, are all reasoned out, logically understood realities. And the same goes for some of the other directives of the Sharia as well. Thus, for example, when the Quran tells us that our political system has to be based on consultation, and it says "Amruhum shura bainahum," it is again something which all of us do relish, that if we are forming someone, or forming a ruler, or forming a government who's going to govern us, then it has to be something which comes into play through our own consultation, because the ruler is going to rule us. So how could you be a person who has a vindictive nature, or who has a veto to his disposal? He has to be someone who should be from amongst us, and at the same time consult all those people with whom he's taking those decisions. So in all its aspects, whether they're the faith aspects or the Sharia aspects, the Quran is a well argued, a well reasoned book. And the translation that I just referring to is a translation that brings out this aspect in a very fluent manner. And personally, I do advise people, or my students, even my colleagues, that to give this translation to the younger generation, what might be a watershed, might be something very beneficial for them. But before you hand over this translation to your young ones, or to your people who'd like to introduce yourself to the Quran, there is another step, or maybe two steps, that should be taken. One of them is that before you give them the Quran or this translation, there is a small book which comes with this book, and which has been published by our institute. It's called The Beginner's Guide to the Quran. So before you enter, or before you start reading that translation, this background, this introduction to the Quran, regarding its language, its history, its structure, its format, the way it talks to people. So it's always good to, when you hand over a book like the Quran, which is a 500-page book, to give it in a format in which it is well introduced. So the first step would be that before you hand over that translation, which addresses human mind in such a profound way, we actually introduce our young ones with a background to the Quran. And the next step, this is again an intermediate step between that introduction to the Quran and the Quran itself, is a book that also has been published by our institute. It's called Selections from the Quran. So it's a very short selections, anthology of the Quranic verses, so that before you start off the Quran in a profound way, you have an overview of the Quran, of the content of the Quran. So it's always good to have a short exposure before you plunge into a major study. So the recommendation would be to read the introduction, then the selection part, and then of course the whole Quran. And once you enter the Quran, always make this it's like a self proclamation or a self realization that it is a book which is going to address your mind. It is going to open your valves of reasoning, so to speak. It's going to make you realize that you're entering or embarking on a journey which is going to take you very close to God. But then you have to read it with understanding. If you don't understand the book of God, you're just going to read it by rote or without understanding it. It's not going to connect you to God at all. It's going to maybe, if I even go as far as to say, maybe take you even farther away from God. So many of our memorizers of the Quran, who might have memorized the Quran by rote, I think you must be knowing that many of them don't even know the translation of the Quran. So we end up, unfortunately, with this disgusting phenomenon of our qaris and our prayer leaders molesting young boys and girls. I mean, for the reason that perhaps they were not meant for this purpose, and they started learning the Quran by heart at a very young age without even knowing what the Quran is telling them. So yes, the first step, as I said, would be to introduce them to the Quran in these three stages, and also give them this background that you are now entering on a ride, so to speak, in which you must always keep your eyes and ears open, and anything which might get stuck in your mind, which you might not think is sitting well with you, which needs to be reasoned out, you must consult a scholar maybe, or a tafsir, or any other resource in which you're able to find out the truth in that manner. The second important, this was the first contribution, as I said, of this translation, that with this background and with these steps, it takes you on this journey of discovering, or may I say, rediscovering your creator. And I think it's one of the most beautiful experiences, that when you connect with God in a way that you're able to understand what He is saying, and also understand the logic and reasoning behind what He is saying, you simply feel enthralled. The second important area which the Quran addresses, and which this translation brings out, is that even before you start reading the Quran, or even before you are embarking on this journey, always remember that the first or the most important thing which the Almighty is going to ask you about is your moral conduct, is your character, is your personal morality that you have. So, besides understanding the Quran, pay special attention to the verses of the Quran which actually speak about that morality, which tell you about how your inner person must be a person who has purified itself. And the word the Quran uses for that is tazkiyah, which means purification. So, purification of your own self, your own beliefs, your own deeds. This is again something which the Quran stresses a lot, and it tells us that the awareness of good and evil is found in our own selves. I mean, we don't need to even go to the Quran to tell us that, well, justice is a good thing, or speaking the truth is a good thing, because that is something that we already know. So what the Quran does is it reminds us, it profoundly reminds us of these realities, that yes, righteousness, goodness, sympathy, kindness, these are things that you have to look for. And today we are more inclined towards a ritualistic uh, edition, if I may say, of religion, in which rituals play a much important part than, I would say, the moral or the dealing part of religion. So, realizing this, one of the most important contributions, I would say, is that when we start reading the Quran, as I said, that introductory booklet, which I was just referring to, is actually a collection of verses which deal with morality, which deal with conduct, which deal with personality development. So, if you pay more attention to these verses in which personality development and character building are stressed, you'll find out that this emphasis goes a long way in that God connection. So, it's like a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, your intellect is being linked with realities which are metaphysical, but they can be argued in favor of. Like, we don't see God, but you can, argue in favor of God. And on the other hand, we have our moral being, our moral sensitivities, our something which relates us to our fellow human beings, regarding which the Quran lays a lot of stress, that we must be individuals who speak the truth, who side by the truth, who abide by the truth. And it's not just an undertaking in the court of law that we say that I'll speak the truth and nothing but the truth. Is something of a commitment of your life. So this moral behavior is something that must never desert us. And this is something which at times it overawes us, it overpowers us when we study the Quran. And a lot of things that we do, they might end up in an intellectual exercise in which we are just trying to understand the intellectual part of the Quran without actually following some of the important directives of the Quran which relate to our personality and our character. So intellect on the one hand and moral development on the other hand. So they go hand in hand, if I may use this term, in understanding or in a more appropriate way in connecting ourselves to God. So this God connection is something which, as Muslims, as human beings, as very weak people, we all need. And this translation actually has this effect on us that when we read through the translation, this moral message of the Quran and this intellectual approach of the Quran, they are transmitted to us in a very, very effective way.